Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully, start a little bit just with the kind of goal for today is to go over a couple of case studies, which I'll introduce here in a little bit, of different things we've done for testing and also designing prototypes for different applications, and going over some of the rules of thumbs and things that can help hopefully make the transition into testing your prototype a little bit smoother. So first off, here at Southwest Research Institute, we often like to kind of show this graph at the left. Um, this is kind of the life cycle of a technology or something new, starting with the background and the fundamental science, moving to basic research, then applied research, product development, and finally when you put this into a production technology. And so universities and labs are kind of known for the fundamental science and some of the basic research. Industry is really good at product development and production. But in between, there's kind of what we call the valley of death, where you kind of have to get over this applied research phase to actually get something to where you can actually produce it. So why is this phase the valley of death? Why is it so difficult? First of all, you usually have multiple systems working together that have never worked together before. And so you have to think through how these different things are going to interact with each other and how they're going to talk and how they're going to play with each other. Um, and then next, not everything works the very first time you try it. In lots of these instances, we had failures, some worse than others, like this picture here. But once something goes wrong, it then kind of extends the project cost and project timeline, and so that can be hard to justify when you didn't identify those things early. And then finally, commissioning, which is kind of defined as the task of identifying if the prototype meets the original specification that you set out, takes a long time and usually takes multiple iterations as you get a better idea of how these systems work together and get different ideas of better control strategies. And so just the fact that this commissioning can take a long time kind of makes it hard to get over this valley of death. And so, in particular, in applied research, we're going to be talking about testing prototypes today, which is a big portion of that. So we're going to look at three different case studies, and I'll be pulling examples from each one of these, not really chronological, just kind of based on what lessons learned we were for each of them. So the first one is design and fabrication of a gas lift test facility. So this one is a little bit different in the other two in that us at Swiri, we weren't actually involved in the prototype design itself. We were just doing the test setup for that prototype. Um, so next was a weather probe power conversion unit. So this was a mobile unit that was used to convert hydraulic power to electrical power that was then used to power weather probe instruments for research. Um, and so this was in a mobile application that presented a couple challenges. And then finally, fabrication and testing of a waste heat engine. So like I said, these last two, Swiri was involved in the design of both the prototype and both the testing to prove out the prototype at the same time. So the first thing we're going to talk about is safety when testing your prototype, especially for the first time. So I showed this picture in the first slide, but this occurred on the waste heat engine project. This was a pretty catastrophic failure that occurred when a swaged union pulled through its swage while it was under pressure. And so you can see all the deformation of the piping there. So one of the big takeaways that hopefully people get from this is that things don't always go as planned. And because they don't go as planned, and because you can't foresee every incident and everything that's going to happen in a prototype, safety needs to be at the back of our mind as the most important goal moving forward. And so actually, I would say that this slide is probably what I would say is maybe one of the biggest and most important takeaways from today. And this kind of comes from our safety engineer here on SWERI, but we're going to kind of go through a pyramid of safety as you're testing these things. So the first step to try and do is to eliminate the hazard altogether. So for example, maybe you're designing something and there could possibly be some sharp edges. So you could easily eliminate that by putting a chamfer or a radius on those edges, and that just completely removes the hazard altogether. And so now you don't have to worry about that hazard at all. Another similar thing is substitution. So is there a way you can substitute the hazard? And so, for example, especially in a fluids application, maybe you're looking at some of the effects on a valve or a probe in methane. And methane prevents some dangers because it is flammable. But do you really need to use methane? Are you just interested in the density? Can you mix a couple other gases to match the density and then substitute it with that type of item? So that's kind of the next step. Third step is probably one of the biggest ones we do because not all the time can you eliminate or substitute the hazard. So the next biggest one is really isolating people from the hazard itself. And so for all of these applications, as we turn it on for the first time, and even as we turn it on as we get more comfortable with it, we always have all the engineers and all the technicians working on it in a separate location from where the actual test is occurring. And so that way, everyone's isolated. If there is something that goes wrong, people aren't aware that the hazard will happen. Finally, even not all the times can you keep people isolated from the instance. For example, for a couple of these different designs we did, leak testing is a big part of that. And when you leak test, you kind of get to a point where people do have to go near the hazard, near a pressurized environment. And so the next step is to put administrative controls in place to make it as safe as possible. So these can be things of like making sure that the system isn't in a transient state as they're doing that, make sure it's static, making sure there's procedures in place that they follow, such as if you do find a leak, that you exit the facility, remove pressure before continuing on to fix that leak, and other procedural controls that you can put into place that people can follow to, of course, keep them safe. And then kind of the last line of defense is wearing personal protective equipment. Again, those don't really have a ton of protection, and so that's kind of why it's the last line of defense. So the biggest takeaway of this is that the higher you go up on the pyramid, the more effective it's going to be, and the least amount of supervision you're going to need to implement it. And so as you're thinking through either designing or testing your prototype, you want to try and kind of climb up the ladder as high as you can. Again, not everything can be eliminated. We understand that, but you can try and get as high as you can to test your prototype safely. And one other safety thing that I'd like to talk about is lockout tagout. And so we are doing a pretty good job at this, especially in the initial design phases for each one of these. We really sat down and identified how can we block out all energy sources when people are working on this. And so some of the big energy sources from a fluids perspective are first pressure. And so lockout tagout control of pressure is often done by closing valves and putting lockout devices on them that isolate part of the loop from a pressurized source. Similarly, electrical, both in moving machines and just electrical in general. And so those are usually locked out on breaker boxes. And then finally, you have mechanical lockout, where you have either physical barriers or physical stops that prevent machinery from rotating or from hands getting into machinery. And so it's important to think through these processes and put your lockout tag out as far upstream as you can to provide the most protection. And one other thing on touching on that, this is a good example from the heat engine project, is be smart about where you put log out, tag out. And so for this test, we had a hot water tank that was pretty close to boiling, and we had initially from the P&ID put the valve right at the heat engine before a hose that was attached to the tank. So when we performed lockout tagout, you still had to disconnect the hose, and now all the hot water from the tank would be spilling out of the hose. And so we identified that very quickly, that that wasn't going to be a very good thing. And so we moved the isolation valve to the front of the tank, so that way when you disconnected the hose, you didn't have hot water from the entire tank coming through. And so you really want to think about how you can get that as far upstream and as close to the energy source as possible. And then also with logout, tagout, always ensure that you're ensuring that the energy has been removed, whether that's by measuring the pressure and ensuring zero pressure on transmitters, or performing a electrical check with a multimeter by a trained electrician. So now get a little bit more into the test setups themselves. So one thing that you should think about in the design phase of your prototype is that sometimes the test setup can be more complicated and more expensive than the prototype itself. And the gas lift facility is a great example of that. So you can see a picture of Sweary's gas lift test facility that we designed here. It had multiple compressors that had to run in tandem to get the flow, and high pressure, higher temperature system. And the valves that we were testing are about 1 to 2 inches in diameter and maybe 18 inches long. And so orders of magnitude larger in cost and in complexity than the prototype itself. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You can still have justification for doing that, but it's something that should definitely be thought through before you start performing your test. You don't want to be surprised that you've put all this money forward to build a prototype, and then it's going to cost the same amount to build something to test it to make sure it works. And so you really need to identify with the cost of the prototype, what is it actually going to cost to test and commission that prototype. So then moving on to design and fabrication. One of my favorite things in engineering is when people come up to me and say, you know, that's not how that's supposed to be or was meant to be used. And as you're going through the prototype process, I think that can kind of happen a lot. You're trying to take something that was originally used for something else and put it in a different application, and that can present some challenges. So again, thinking through that and asking the question, how is this component normally used, can hopefully help you to prevent issues from occurring in the future. So again, going back to the gas lift test facility, we had these large compressors that we were using to compress our gas for the test loop. And from the manufacturer, how they were originally used is you had a low pressure volume that came from a source, and it was an open loop, so one direction. You would pump it up to high pressure and go from there. And so the difference in our application is that we were using this in a closed loop process. So that same high pressure volume that we had uh, uh, pumped up, we would then drop it in pressure to then put it at the inlet of the pump. And so what the major difference was from the original application is the original application, when you just have a volume, it's at low temperature. So whether you're pulling from a cylinder or kind of pulling from cryogenic and then pumping it up, it's much closer to ambient conditions, where in our closed loop, we were putting in high temperatures. So even though the compressor was built to handle the temperature at the end of the compression stroke, it was not built to handle the pressure or the temperature at the inlet going through the entire stroke. And so what that did is basically melted the seals on the compressors themselves, and so we were getting a lot of leakage, and that way we couldn't meet the flow rate we originally had. And so we found this out during the commissioning process and updated the seals we were using. But again, had we have thought of how this component is normally used, we might have done a better job at identifying this before the commissioning process itself. Similarly, on our waste heat engine project, we were using a heat exchanger. So original use for a heat exchanger such as this, a cross-flow heat exchanger, you have your gas coming in one side, going through, your water coming in from the other side in counterflow operation, and it's pretty close to steady state most of the time. But for our application, we were putting either hot or cold water to push the gas, expand the gas, or compress the gas into the heat exchanger itself. And so this ended up putting a lot more pressure cycles on the heat exchanger than in the normal operation. And again, what this ended up doing was, because of the pressure cycles, the seals that it was designed to have were not able to handle those pressure swings. And so we were getting decompression of seals. And again, moving to how is this normally used, how are we using it, could have helped to identify that, again, in this application, we needed much more hard seals than in the original application. So I think one of my favorite things I've learned in the process of doing these types of system prototypes is that we want to focus on the system must be optimized, not the individual components. And so for the hydraulic to electrical power conversion unit that we were designing and testing, we had a hydraulic motor that was used to spin a electrical generator. And so these two components had two different efficiencies associated with them. And the designers of the generator in particularly were adamant that it should run at 9,000 or close to its optimal efficiency, or else we were going to have to add additional cooling to it and make our system a little bit more complex. Well, the motor that we had selected based on some other specifications really had a drop in efficiency out there. And so the total system efficiency ended up being so low that we couldn't meet the power requirement required by the weather instruments themselves. And so with a little bit of forethought, we were able to add the additional cooling and do an updated design point where not the generator efficiency, but the system efficiency was optimized at its peak so that we could meet the requirement of the system. And so we knew this beforehand, and so we had done a little bit to kind of give this next guideline. So really trying to design the system to be modular, where parts can be replaced with something that has the same form factor. So like I said, the original motor that we had selected for the hydraulics was trying to match that 9,000 RPM. And when we moved to the 7,500 RPM design point, we had to use a different displacement motor to match the flow of the hydraulics. But we had thought of this beforehand. We knew it was kind of risky to try and run at the 9,000 RPM. And so we ensured that we selected a motor that had where the other displacement motor also had the same form factor, just a little bit of length added to it. So there was no additional machining, there was no additional reassembly. We were able to just take the motor right out and replace it directly with the higher displacement motor, and that way we were able to eliminate some of the downtime that we had as we were trying to make sure that we could meet the requirement in the commissioning process. And so really trying to leave yourself space where you can put additional components, really thinking through if this valve fails, can we get another valve that is the same size-ish so that we don't have to redo all our piping. Thinking through those type of things where it can be modular and items can be easily replaced will really prevent you from having to replace your system altogether, but just replace individual components that might not meet the expectations that you originally thought they could. So going on that same concept, for this design we used cartridge valves, hydraulic cartridge valves, and what ended up happening was that the controls of the generator, its voltage controls, and the controls on a manual flow control device were kind of disagreeing with each other, and so it sent flow oscillations through our system. But again, we had kind of identified that we could use some other options, and so we were able to put a adapter cartridge valve in the same form factor that was electronically controlled instead of a passive controlled device, and then that way we were able to get the stability that we required for the system. So again, making sure that parts can be easily replaced and have a similar form factor can reduce the downtime during commissioning. Next, making things easy to take apart. And so as you're going through commissioning of a prototype, I would be very surprised if you never had to take it apart once or take some components apart. This is kind of a bad example of how not to make things easy to take apart. Based on customer requirements, we were asked to use castle nuts on all our components. Castle nuts, like this picture in the right, have little slots where you can put a pin through them. And so the screw or bolt that you attach this nut to, you put a pin through that hole that goes through these little castles, and that way it locks it into place. So if there's vibrations or anything, your nut can't turn. But not only did we have these castle nuts, but they were hidden between these two plates that were only about 4 or 5 inches apart. And so we put it all together just like we had it in the drawing the first time, and then after a day or two of commissioning, we realized that we had to take it apart to check a couple of the electrical wires. And so removing those pins and then removing those castle nuts became an issue that probably added a day's worth of work that was not necessary had we thought through a little bit better how we might take these apart. And so doing things like temporarily having easier methods to take it apart that might be different. So for example, we didn't have to have this all bolted together. We could have had it clamped together in the beginning until it was finished. And then once we were ready for a sell-off, we could have put the nuts on. But trying to make things and think through is this easy to disassemble? Again, can eliminate some of the amount of time it takes as you go through the commissioning process. And then also thinking through the right type of connectors for electrical components. Again, thinking through these types of questions. Can it be taken apart easily? Can it handle the environment it's in, especially if there's water or other fluids? And are there enough pins for the number of wires? And in addition to that, can you choose connectors that have extra pins so that you can add additional wires or transmitters if needed through the process? You don't want to be lacking, especially since it's easier to get a connector with a couple extra pins. So as you're going through the design process and you're going through the test setup design, you really want to think about how is this system going to be controlled. So each one of these cases had a different method of control. The first was a custom software that we built in-house with the DAC system. For another one, we used custom software that was made by someone else. And last, you kind of have the manual control of dials and switches. So custom software made by you, some of the pros are that it's really the easiest way to change things on the fly. And again, for each one of these projects, as we went through the commissioning process, we found better ways that we wanted to control the system. And so the software needed to be changed. If you make it yourself, you have a lot of control when those things can be changed. And in addition to that, you're the one who best understands how your system works. And so you're going to be better positioned to understand how you want to change that software. The cons, at least for us, this often means it's more expensive. And also it adds to the commissioning process because not only do you have to commission all the components, now you also have to debug software that has never been used before. It can require extra hardware, and it can add time because you have to then document the software as well. Some of the pros and cons of custom software made by someone else. First of all, the cost is what is quoted, and so you don't have to worry about additional cost because you weren't able to correctly identify how long it would take to do the software. And then also you don't need software licenses because someone else is taking care of that software development. The cons, you really need to have good communication. Lots of things can be lost in translation. And then as you start to change things on the fly, you're kind of required to wait on somebody else's availability. And then also, although you don't have to do the documentation, you also have to rely on someone else's documentation and hope that they document it well enough that it's easy to use. Finally, manual control. Usually this is pretty simple and it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot because you don't have to work through software issues. And that also means you don't have to have a DAC, so there's less hardware. But the cons, you can't have complex controls like open this valve when this happens, or have additional safety features like that. If you're just doing gauges and dials, you don't have data storage, and it's a little bit harder to remove yourself from the prototype as you use these valves. So moving on to commissioning, again, we kind of describe commissioning as the testing procedure of showing that the prototype does what you think it does. And so my first recommendation for commissioning is test as many components individually as possible. And so one good example of this is for the hydraulic motors we were talking about earlier. They came with magnetic pickup sensors to measure RPM. Again, we threw this right in the system. It came from the manufacturer. We thought it should work pretty easily. As we started going through the commissioning, we felt like we were spinning faster than what this was picking up. And so we then had to go through the process of removing the motor, putting it somewhere else, and using a separate tachometer to measure how fast it was spinning. And it turned out that that was right. There was a little bit of issue of this communicating with the dial, but that would have been easily something to figure out had we tested it out beforehand and before we put it all together, just by even moving uh, the motor by hand. I think we would have been able to identify that before the process. And so, especially with bigger prototype and test projects, you usually have different lead times of different components. And so, as each component comes in, thinking of ways of how can I make sure that this works before I put it into an entire system can add a little bit more upfront labor cost, but hopefully reduce the amount of commissioning time it takes later. And I think one of the next most important things and one of the next biggest takeaways from this is make sure you understand what you expect to measure and how that compares to what you are really measuring. So through a commissioning process, again, we're trying to identify if this is meeting specifications. And so you're going to have to take measurements in a couple locations to prove that. But what we're physically measuring isn't always what we think we're measuring. So one good example of this is we had the heat exchanger, as discussed earlier, and we wanted to know what the gas temperature it was on the shell side of the heat exchanger in the middle of the heat exchanger. Well, you can't exactly do that because of all the tubes going through the heat exchanger. But in addition to that, based on some of the other design limitations of where piping had to be connected, the RTD we were using was actually pretty far removed from where we expected to get the measurement. So it was in a stagnation area. In addition, there was a lot of there was issues with the thermal time constant based on how fast our dynamic process was happening, and the actual gas had a gradient throughout the pipe, and so we were maybe a foot removed from where we actually wanted to measure, and just that temperature gradient meant that we weren't close to what we wanted to measure. And so it's important to identify that just because we want this measurement, it may not be physically possible, or the sensors we're using might not be measuring what you think you are measuring. So with that, it's important to understand if you're trying to measure a steady state or a dynamic process. So with that RTD that I showed, they usually will have a response time associated with them. So we were trying to look at the temperature rate of change on a time constant of something close to a second. Well, the response time of this might be 2 seconds, and so you're really not measuring the actual temperature of the fluid as it quickly goes from one temperature to another. Additionally, there can be lots of noise introduced into the system. Some of this can just be general uncertainty noise, but some of this can also be due to other electric cables and poor shielding. And so you really want to understand what is affecting your sensors and how they are measuring the process. So with that, and knowing that you are, especially for a first-time prototype, might run into these types of issues, my recommendation for that is to take many more measurements than you would normally expect to have for a production unit. So the reason we were able to overcome some of the challenges of that heat exchanger is that elsewhere we were measuring had a measurement of piston location, which was directly coupled to the heat exchanger. So now we had volume and we had pressure, and so we were able to get an estimate for temperature of the bulk fluid. Um, Again, that's still probably not as accurate as we would have liked, but it was much closer than the measurement we were making, especially at the high speeds we were going at. And then finally, use what's already available for measurements. This is a good example. We wanted to know what flow of a hydraulic fluid we were running through our system. Um, we could have spent a lot of money on an expensive flow meter, but we had a hydraulic motor that we were measuring the RPM and we knew the displacement of. And although it's definitely not quite as accurate as having a flow meter, it was accurate enough for our application to estimate what the flow rate was based on the displacement and RPM, the RPM of the motor itself. So that kind of concludes our webinar for today, and we will go on with any questions if anybody has any of those.
All right. I have a few questions here. So one question is, you mentioned that the commissioning time can be high. It can take a long time to commission a new test setup. So how do you predict how much commissioning time is required?
Um, that is probably a real difficult question. Uh, um, I guess maybe my best response without taking a lot of time to think about it is kind of what they say with software. Take what time you think it's going to take and multiply it by 4. And I think that's a good starting location for how long commissioning will take. But again, it kind of depends on the complexity of the system itself. But I think as a starting point, that may get you somewhere pretty close.
So at what stage in the prototype development process should someone start considering the test setup design?
So I think generally we kind of go through a conceptual design, a detailed design, and then a final design. I think for a conceptual design, you want to at least identify kind of how you're going to test it, but probably not get too much in the weeds of what that looks like. Um, um, but at least kind of get the initial thoughts of, hey, we're going to need to measure the power output to make sure that this works, and we're going to need to measure this. But then I think really kind of in the detailed design especially is where you really want to nail down your test setup, um, which is still before you get your final design. You definitely want to be thinking about that and have a pretty good and pretty close to finished test setup done.
Okay. Last question is, do you use any validation procedures on the test setup for the data acquisition system?
So we, in our group, we have a software validation, I guess, protocol where the person who designed the software, usually working uh, with their manager, will fill in kind of a procedure spreadsheet that we already have, where they're going to identify all the steps that someone would take to validate that software, put it in a procedure, and for each step require someone to verify that something happened in the software. And then they would give it to someone with that hasn't done the software validation, or sorry, has not been working on the software itself. That's kind of removed from that. Uh, that then they have to go through the procedures, and that helps validate the software, but it also makes sure that kind of your testing procedures are at enough detail that you could pass them off to someone else and they could still understand them. So then, in addition to that, we separately usually have a separate set of commissioning procedures, and lots of times those are kind of driven by the uh, customer themselves or the person that's looking to get something out of that prototype design, they're going to set the initial requirements of the prototype of it needs to do this much power, it needs to have this, it needs to have this. And so for each one of those requirements, you would then set up a procedure for how you're going to test that specific requirement. And so generally on those commissioning procedures, we'll start with the easiest thing and then work our way up to the most complicated item.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you very much for the webinar today, and we appreciate everybody calling in. We'll have this up on YouTube at some point.